Hello and welcome to the Foundational Gut Health Workshop with the JCN Clinic. I'm Jessica Cox, and this is actually a workshop we have run for the past year through live Zoom recordings where we've had our audience come along in a live manner, but times are changing and a lot of you want to be able to watch things in your own time. So we've decided to make this an online recording so you can purchase and watch when suits you. So today is lesson 1 of this 6-part workshop. So let's get started. This overall workshop is designed to create an educational foundation for you in regard to gut health. Therefore, we're looking at teaching you what real quality healthy gut health is about. We want you to know how to understand your gut and how then you can move forward to improve your gut health. We also want to enable you to learn how to modify information for your own needs, which is actually really important because there's so much information out there. And if you understand these basic foundations, then you can absolutely apply the changes that are necessary for you. It's just that confidence that you need to do so. And also this workshop's about allowing you to learn these tools that for me is the most important aspect that enables you to get some long-lasting change. And instead of feeling like you're controlling symptoms that are just constantly causing you grief with your gut, you learn some tools to navigate that, and they're valuable ongoingly. Now, just a reminder that this is a workshop, and of course it's going to differ from a one-on-one consultation as we would hold at the JCN Clinic. So in that format, we're going to dive deeper into your health and be able to break things down on a more individual level. So you need to understand that the information we're learning is tiered to help with a more broad stroke. However, I cannot express that it's still super valuable. But if you do need to dive deeper, if you get to the end of this workshop and you feel like you'd like to explore further, you can contact us anytime at the JCN Clinic. You'll notice there's some little links there. Essentially, you'll see there's a PDF that is attached to the workshop and for each lesson. So they will be the notes that we're looking over each lesson, and you can click on those links to take you through. So today, lesson 1 is cause and effect, and we're looking at how the gut can come up with these pesky issues and the mechanisms involved because they are multifactorial. We'll look at lesson 2 at what we call breaking the cycle. So that's understanding how the mechanisms of your gut issues can help break the cycle. And we want to learn from there how to implement these changes that break apart these cycles that can feed back in a negative way and change that to a more positive feedback. In the 3rd lesson, we'll look at the use of functional testing, which is a really exciting one. So we'll learn about the need for investing in functional testing when that's appropriate and how to make those decisions, what types of functional testing are useful for what types of conditions, and then how we can be really insightful for this information and use this to individualize your treatment further for your gut. In lesson 4, you'll notice lesson 4 and 5 are broken apart. So we spend, of course, a lot of time talking about diet. So the first part is how to take your daily food intake and make some changes to complement health needs. So we'll talk a bit about things, very popular topics like FODMAP diets, something we call at the JCN low fermentable carbohydrate diets, and maybe where these might be appropriate and why. And then in lesson 5, we look in part 2 at how we move through some of these dietary protocols where there might be some form of restrictions and how we move out of that and confidently build up the diet again. So we're not stuck there. And within that space, we'll talk about the importance of diversity of whole food and why that's important for building a really robust gut long-term. Lesson 6, the final one, we'll talk about the role of supplements and medicinal foods. So this one's really about understanding where supplements fit and also food as a medicinal source. This is something at the JCN clinic we are passionate about, how we can take food in an everyday way and use it in this medicinal way. There's a plethora of ways this can be done. So I want to look at how we can implement these food changes to support your gut, and then of course, long-term, what you can do for your health there. A few terms you'll see along the way, and just for reference, microbiome, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that. So this refers to the microorganisms and their genes. So it's essentially the whole genetic material that contribute to our health overall in our gut. So it's kind of like the whole conglomerate of everything. Whereas we'll often also use, and you'll hear interchangeably, microbiota, and that's just referring to the microbes themselves without all the other matter. Does it make a massive difference to you understanding your health? Probably not, but for the purpose of education and also for what you see out there, I think it's important to kind of be familiar with those terms. Something we'll talk a lot about is the mucosal lining. So we have this mucus lining that is a layer of the gastrointestinal tract, and it's a very important protective barrier. It has multiple functions, and there's a lot of immune activity here. There's a lot of interplay with bacteria and microbes overall. So it's an important aspect that we'll be mentioning pretty much every time we talk. And then something called secretory IgA. This is an immunoglobulin, and it's secreted at the gut lining, and it modulates access to these microorganisms and even antigens within the gut. So it's like a little immune modulator, and we'll talk about that as we go along. It's a very important marker in testing and has a lot to do with, or one of the things has a lot to do with our gut health. So let's dive into cause and effect. So what does this actually mean in the gut health space? So cause and effect is really about understanding not only your current issues right now, what's wrong with my gut right now, what's driving me crazy about my gut, but it's more importantly about understanding how your gut issues came to be and what mechanisms have been involved within this along the way. The reason for this is that your gut issues don't just start up overnight from anywhere. It's not, for most of the time, just a quick sort of flare up out of the blue. In most cases, it is a constant and steady increase in symptoms that build up over time. We often refer to it a little bit more like different health assaults, different layers. And what happens there is we're slowly seeing a change in the terrain of the gut microbiota, so those microbes within the gut. And then as that's changing into a more negative or adverse environment, that starts creating changes with inflammation and the way the immune system reacts in the gut. So understanding these layers, we often use the analogy, and some of you may have heard of it, of that onion, and how they layer on top of each other is really important because it helps us understand the center of that onion and where the origin lies, and understanding where things have come from is super important in knowing how to treat. So causes are in most cases, a collection of factors. So we have created the onion layers, but ultimately this is going to lead to these symptoms that we're experiencing. So there can be singular cases, but really when dealing with long-standing gut issues, it's super, super rare. The main things I would see that might be like a one-off issue might be someone has had really recent gastro, say you're generally fine, you don't have any gut issues at all, and you've had some recent food poisoning, and you've just felt really, really horrible from that. That might just be a catalyst that just needs addressing. You might have just a food allergy or an intolerance that is causing issues, and it's just a matter of taking that out of your diet or adjusting the diet and everything is tip top. Though I must say that even that one often has long-term effects, because if you've been eating something you're reactive to for years and years and years, it has that inflammatory effect on the gut. So it starts to get a little deeper. So an example of some multi-factor cases, so these are causes that we're talking about that are more these layerings. The first point in understanding this is appreciating that these multifactorial causes, they take time to develop. And in a lot of cases, they're usually over the timeline of our lives. So you'll even see, and some of you watching this might be able to relate to this, that you've had some issues since you were young. I know that I will see clients where they'll even know from birth there were issues as far as being a really colicky baby, really not taking to milk well, or even in some cases, like people will know about how things were for them through pregnancy, just being able to talk to their mothers or fathers, obviously more their mother, maybe their father can relay the information for the mother, that perhaps a mother really suffered with issues while pregnant with the baby that then has some issues that can flow on to the health of the microbiome. But what I'm trying to get across is that we want to think about where these layers have started and how they have built up over time. So in regards to this space with even these earlier years, this is actually relatively common. We can get mums that may have food intolerances that they're just not aware of it. Probably the most common one we see might be a mum who's reactive to dairy. She's still eating that throughout her pregnancy, and she may have some microbiome health issues herself. And we can see that, and research now highlights this, that we have this shared microbiome. It's not a sterile environment as such with the baby. So there can be that interplay with the microbiome of the bub, and that can put that baby or that bub kind of behind the back foot from the start with the health of the gut, and may mean that we might see signs as the baby starts to grow with things like colic and rashes and bowel upsets, running noses. So these would be classic symptoms that you might know. You might be like, hey, that was me as a kid. I've been told that I had all of those or a collection of those. It's really problematic with these reactivities, but then I grew out of it. So the immune system will change as a baby grows and an infant grows, but a lot of the time it can sort of shift in ways that might not be as obvious anymore, that there's some reactivity going on. And often we'll see that as you grow older, maybe moving to teenage years or into early 20s, and we can see these sort of reactivity starting to come about. Another one might be antibiotic use. So we're in modern medicine days. Antibiotics are amazing. They save lives when needed, but they can be overused, as I think a lot of you know. They may be used a lot for youth, particularly in these cases. If we've got someone that's had a lot of these issues, we see a lot of respiratory infections, tonsillitis, ear infections. And then maybe as we see that shift into teenage years, there might be lots of acne and use of antibiotics there. So already we can see a picture there where we've got a lot of layers that are starting to occur that can show why a microbiome and that sort of gut immune system can be affected as far as having a nice robust base. So we have these layers, and it's, you know, we're not even into the 20s yet, but hopefully you can see how we're starting to see this connectivity as we move through. Now, I need to highlight in this space talking about infants and this sort of mother space. Of course, no one does this with knowledge that they're eating something that's going to cause effect onto their unborn baby, or feeding their infants foods that they're reactive to on purpose. Like it's a space where there's a lack of education. It's getting better, but please understand that it's not about saying that we should be doing better there, or someone's done something wrong. It's purely about learning and then education moving forward. So these intolerances and allergies that aren't dealt with or even understood essentially at an early age, what we see is they can become one of these first layers that builds in creating this inflammation of the gut. And because that food is still in the diet over the years and years and years, it's like this niggling inflammation that may not be enough to have these outwardly symptoms as obvious as eat food, run to the toilet, have diarrhea. But it's like an aggravating point, like a little like thistle stuck somewhere in your clothes that you can't find, that's just itching away. So these food proteins from these foods, they set off an inflammatory response in the gut, our immune system within our gut. Now we call this GALT for short, as an acronym for gut-associated lymphatic tissue. Do you need to know that? Not really, but just in case you see that popping up. But what we have is this release of all these inflammatory cells that are responding to this really constant aggravation, to that thorn at that mucus layer we talked about earlier in the gut. And then that is going to cause an upset to the microbiome. The other thing we can see with the more time this has, that it can potentially increase permeability. So we should have nice, tight cells that are bound together. Things can't essentially pass through as effectively. We know that gluten in particular can have an effect on increasing or opening these gaps for a little longer than we would like. So if we've got someone with ongoing intake of gluten and they're highly sensitive to gluten, we need to consider that. And essentially it's going to, with time, just really encourage these imbalances of commensal flora. So commensal is more talking about kind of common flora. So they're common bacteria, common yeast, common potentially even protozoal parasites. There's a bit of debate about like what should or shouldn't live in the gut there with a few. But essentially, instead of that world being in a lovely balance, this inflammation is leading to this imbalance of these flora. Now, I love this little diagram to start to give an idea. I'm all about pictures of what we're talking about. So on the left here, we've got a healthy gut. This snake essentially here, this is the layer of cells on the gut lining, this mucus lining. So it's pretty fascinating that it's actually just one layer of cells that's protecting our inside from our outside. We have these strong, tight junctions. So that's those spaces, those in-between spaces, and they're nice and tight. So things can't essentially pass through that shouldn't. We've got a strong mucosal barrier. So this blue C area, think of it like that mucus layer we're talking about. So it's a barrier between here, which is inside your intestinal tract and all the bacteria and the food particles, and the cells, and this side where we've got some immune activity. And we've got essentially, because we don't have anything triggering down here, it's this low mucosal inflammation. There's nothing triggering it off. Up here, we've got a good diversity of bacteria with the microbiota, and we've got a low level of pathogens. Down here, what we've got, some interesting little creatures. We've got different immune cells. So basically things like macrophages, etc. Again, you don't need to know that. We just need to remember we've got these immune cells that are very close here, ready to respond. So over here, we have what we call dysbiosis, which we use for the name of an imbalance of bacteria, particularly in the lower bowel. And you'll hear the term leaky gut thrown around. We prefer to gut permeability, but same. What you'll see here is we've got a lower diversity of quality bacteria. We've also got more of these, what we call LPS. See these little guys floating around? They're still over here. They're always around, but there's a higher low. These are these little inflammatory lipopolysaccharides, they're called. And what you can see is this overabundance of these mucus degrading and toxin producing pathogens. So basically too much of a load of this is actually damaging this mucus lining, and it's degrading it down. And as it's degrading this layer, it's going to open up and expose these cells. So what we'll also see is some of these have the potential to open up these junctions or create a weakness in these junctions. And we can see this flow of these LPS cascading through. And as a result here, we can see there's more of an immune response, because of course the immune system's going to go, what's all this? What's going on? And we get this increased inflammation and essentially this aggravation. Now, remember, inflammation, I often say to my clients, think of when you fall over, hurt your wrist, swells up, maybe you've sprained an ankle. What we know is that when things are inflamed, they hurt, there's fluid and a lot of swelling. So you need to think about those as like visceral reactions going on within this space with this increased inflammation. So if there's more swelling and fluid, we're going to see lots of bloating and upsets, let alone what the bacteria are doing there. We may have pain going on. All of these little LPSs, like this is also to remember, this is our bloodstream. So once things come through here, they can move systemically around the body. It's not like a closed off section. So this is what we talk about when we see increased permeability of the gut and things creating inflammation throughout the body, because it's not just here, this can now travel. So moving on, keeping that visual in mind, let's talk about that space of adolescence through to young adult life. So some things that we may see as far as causes, menstrual problems for women. So there can be OCP use, which for some women, no issues at all, but there'll be others where that can actually, I should confirm that's the oral contraceptive pill. But for some women, that can actually really upset their gut. We talked about the use of antibiotics and again, the OCP for acne control. It's also the time that we're going to see more alcohol intake. And of course, even just poor nutrition, which is massive. So as kids are growing up, they're leaving home. We all probably can relate to this. We don't eat, excuse me, as well. There may be an increase in junk food, eating out, takeaway, just essentially not structuring our food as effectively or as healthy as it may have been when we were at home with our parents. So another thing, maybe not so common of late, would be travel. Once we hit our 20s, a lot of us are traveling overseas. There's a lot of people I talk to have done this and experienced some pretty obscene gastro episodes, me included, from traveling overseas. So we've got this as well going on in this time. We may have more stress, like as a younger kids, usually stress isn't too bad, but as we're getting into these years, there can be more stress going on, and that higher cortisol impacts our enzyme secretion. So we may not be digesting food as effectively, can even have an impact on our secretory IgA levels. So that was that important immunoglobulin that helps keep the gut lining we're looking at nice and plump in its own right. And there might even be viruses. So some people will find that they might at this time or through their teenage years pick up, say, glandular Epstein-Barr virus, and they've never really felt well since. So there's a whole cascade of things in this time that often are really important to understand. And again, the reason why is that this will influence what we do as far as changes and treatment. Because if we know that there's been a viral episode that's probably been one of the major catalysts for you, that's going to change how we look at things as far as maybe the immune system and the viral load that your body might still be carrying versus someone that's had some really chronic gastro from travel and how we might think about that, or someone that's had like really, really poor nutrition for just a decade. So all of these things will influence how we might think about making changes for you as an individual. So all of these factors or a collection of these factors essentially are going to accumulate over time, and they will create this level of ongoing inflammation and aggravation in that gastrointestinal tract. So ultimately what we'll see, as we saw in that picture, is an imbalance or an overgrowth, or sometimes even an undergrowth of these commensal bacteria, yeasts, parasites. Undergrowth is important to consider, and it's something that I often see that people don't really think about. They're more of the liking of faith. It's an interesting word to use, but they're more expecting it to be this overload of these pathogens. But often when you test the gut microbiome, you can see a lot of undergrowth, and in bacteria, as we saw again with those pictures, have such an important role in keeping the gut really healthy. So undergrowth is vital to address. And then with this whole story, we have that increased inflammation at that mucosal lining. So we saw how that can really trigger the immune system and really what we call upregulate it or activate it. And it gets really angry. Think of like sort of kicking a bee's nest or the hornet's nest, as the saying goes, and seeing that really angry response. Or sometimes we can actually see a decreased immune activation in the gut, where essentially it's like fatigued, it's had enough. And you might see that with someone who's had like a viral load for a really long time, and it's like really just, oh, I've got nothing left in the tank. And you can see that when you do testing. So we can test that secretory IgA we've been talking about, and then we can test some inflammatory markers in the gut too, which we'll see in lesson 3. And we can see with all of this that we might get that permeability happening, or as referred to, leaky gut. But really, even without this, these top 3 are more than enough to really disrupt your gut and make you feel unwell. So what are the local effects on the gut? When we say local, like literally in your gut, what are common effects of all of this? And probably some of the things that have made you want to dive into this workshop. Bowel upsets, so constipation, diarrhea, or an alternation between the two. Stools themselves, there might be mucus in the stool. Some of you may have never even noticed this. Good idea to just check out the toilet bowl. So there might be signs of mucus that looks a little bit snotty in the stool, usually a white color. Blood is something you should be looking for. Undigested food. In saying that, a little bit of some seeds or corn is normal, but if there's obvious chunks of food, like pieces of meat, chunks of broccoli, those sorts of things, then that's important, and we should be treating that. Bloating, probably one of the most common aggravating symptoms. So a real distension of your abdomen, that may be with wind or without. Some people can have horrible bloating and no wind, and others have copious amounts of winds. And again, with or without odor, sometimes it's super stinky and others there's nothing. Lots of belching, so upper gastric symptoms, lots of burping, belching, indigestion, reflux. Pain, of course, pain. So abdominal pain, when we're talking locally, you might feel like it's lower, upper, all around, cramping, stabbing pains. And then malabsorption, not one that we really feel as such happening, but often can be felt as fatigue. Something that we don't think about as much, but we've hinted at when we looked at that blood flow in the gut, is systemic effects. Fatigue, it's a massive one with gut issues. And the reason being, we have poor absorption, as we're just looking at. So we may not be absorbing our nutrients as effectively. And also inflammation in general is really taxing. It's like, we always say it's like having a cold or a flu. We feel run down because our immune system's really busy dealing with fighting that infection or that inflammation. So the more involved it is there, the more taxing that is on our energy. Brain fog is really common. What this means is like this foggy cloud feeling in your head, like you just haven't had a good night's sleep for days on end. It's really common with chronic yeast overgrowth and some really high numbers of bacteria. Aching joints, very, very common. So it's more of like, it can be in just some places. I know sometimes people just be like aching hands for no reason, but often people feel like it's kind of in all their joints and it's being looked at, and it's not, well, it's going to say it's not arthritis and it's not other sort of conditions, but the thing is that it can be diagnosed as things like rheumatoid arthritis and so forth, but there can be on top of that a gut layer that is a causative factor. But essentially, I want you to not rule out the gut involvement in aching joints if that's something that you experience. Skin issues, so acne, eczema, dermatitis, things like rashes and rosacea are massive factors. Now, this is one that again can be like, what, why would that be related to my gut? So after we have that absorption from our gut into the bloodstream, that's all traveling primarily first and foremost to our liver. And then our liver is going through its detoxification processes. And then we have our lymphatic system that works synergistically with all of this as far as like clearing of toxins. And if that whole process is overwhelmed, then what happens is that the liver is kind of like, oh, what am I going to do? Where am I going to put all of this? And we forget that our skin is one big elimination organ. So it will use the skin to push out this extra debris. So it's super common to see skin issues with gut issues. There could be hormones, of course, involved too, but often there'll be a gut involvement. So the effect on the gut of all the variety of these symptoms has really led us to create these classifications of symptoms that are commonly associated with what the underlying cause may be. So one of these, which we have already mentioned, is dysbiosis. So when we're looking at dysbiosis, what we're talking about is that we know that there is a strong overgrowth or undergrowth, so we can have both sides of bacteria, yeast, or potentially some protozoa. And this is usually more to do with the lower bowel when we use this term, which is where the majority of these bacteria or these microbes lay. That's their sort of main space. Then we have something called SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. This is more when bacteria are overgrown in the small intestinal tract, so higher up. And it tends to, we'll see as we move through the lessons, it tends to be a little different in its presentations, but both of them can cause a lot of the symptoms I've talked about to date. Then, as we saw, we often use leaky gut or preferably gut permeability. And if we are talking about this, we're talking about there being that passageway where things can essentially pass through, like food proteins, bacterial debris, and we're seeing an increased immune response and potentially that flow of some of this matter, these what we call little endotoxins, so internal toxin production via the blood or the lymphatic system. Food intolerances and allergies are also another classification area. So we can have reactivity to the proteins in the foods. We've got IgG reactions, IgA, and then we have IgE, which is more of an allergy. So common things here might be dairy, eggs, nuts. We have FODMAPs, so we can have particular types of carbohydrates that we can be intolerant to. We'll be talking about this in a lot more detail in further lessons. And then we can have food chemical sensitivity. So things like histamine, sulfur, salicylates, not as common. And I'm sure a lot of you viewing this won't fall into this category, but it is one to highlight. So overall, all these different expressions of ill health will come back to a core driver at the center of all of these symptoms, no matter how they're differing from person to person. So we always are looking at all of these collections, but what's sitting at that core? You essentially cannot have an effect without an underlying cause. There has to be something that is driving all of these symptoms, this bloating, this brain fog, this fatigue, this loose bowel, like all of these different things that you feel like sometimes you're trying to target individually. It's like, what is at the core that's setting that up off? So if we understand that cause that we've just talked through and how it led to the effect, that's how we know ultimately how to treat the core driver, and we know where to step next to gain results. So we will dive into this in our next lesson, which is breaking the cycle. And here we're going to look at understanding the mechanisms of the gut, all these gut issues, and how we can create a break in this cycle, and therefore, most importantly, start to see a change for the positive. Thanks for joining me for lesson 1. If you have any questions after the lesson, you can leave them in the comments section of the lesson. Otherwise, again, thanks for joining me today, and see you at lesson 2.